hesitating. You've been waiting all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment.
Hello, hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Samanthropolitics. It is October 30th. I don't know about you, but I'm freaking out a little bit because the United States election is literally around the corner on Tuesday. I really hope everyone here has voted and or is knocking on doors and or is making phone calls. If I learned anything from working on Hillary's campaign in 2016 is that we need every single person's help to make sure that we get out the vote. I have an incredible guest today. I just want to go over a brief thing that happened this week that was pretty monumental with the scope of women's rights, which was that Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed to the United States Supreme Court, which is wild, considering that Merrick Garland was hung out to dry for, I think it was between 6 and 8 months, and yet Coney Barrett was pushed through in lightning fast speed, 8 days before the election, even though when it came to Merrick Garland, the Republicans said over and over and over again, based on Abraham Lincoln, we shall not put a Supreme Court justice in an election year. And then they had no issue confirming somebody 8 days before the election. So clearly they actually don't care about letting the people decide. That was all just a bunch of garbage. With regards to women's rights, we're going to see. Coney Barrett says that she is about the law. She's not about, her religious views, and she's not going to let those influence her rulings. But that really remains to be seen. We have a lot at stake this election, and reproductive health care is also extremely on the line in the U.S., which is scary to even say. But I want to move to our guest today pretty quickly because she is amazing, and feel beyond privileged to have her here with me today. I joke that I am a fangirl of my guest, Ambassador Verveer. Melanne Verveer is the executive director of the Georgetown University's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. The Institute has a pretty big global presence, and it seeks to enhance national and global security by documenting the role women play in peace building and security through research and scholarship, and by engaging with global leaders on the urgent issues of our time. She also serves as the special representative on gender equality for the OSCE chairmanship. Now, Ambassador Verveer is particularly special because she is the first ambassador. In 2009, she was nominated by President Obama to be the first ever U.S. ambassador for global women's issues in a whole new bureau created at the State Department, the Office for Global Women's Issues. So her experience and just pioneering this new office is something that we're going to talk about first. Prior to that, she was also the co-CEO of Vital Voices Global Partnership. And earlier to that, she served as assistant to the president and chief of staff to the first lady in the Clinton administration. She is a recipient of numerous awards, including the U.S. Secretary of State's Award for Distinguished Service. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Ambassador Verveer.
Well, hi, and Samantha, it's great to be with you. You're so energized. I feel energized.
Oh, good. I'm so excited.
I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Hopefully, I can also bring as much energy when I'm knocking on doors in Pennsylvania this weekend to motivate people to get their butts to the polls.
Well, that's a good place to go. It's my home state, and we never know how it's going to turn out.
It's unbelievably important. So,
I want to jump battleground state.
I know, and it's just going to be. It's like, so Hillary Clinton came on one of our phone banks the other day, and she said, basically, don't count your chickens. Everything may look good, but we just don't know, right?
Well, I think that's really good advice. If you think back to how many of us felt in 2016, we were feeling pretty good. And I remember that night at the Javits Center, just going worse and worse and worse until it was just impossible to believe the outcome was what it became. So never count your chickens before they're hatched, so to speak.
Yeah. So, I want to at the period where you were appointed by President Obama to head this brand new department, the Office of Global Women's Issues. I mean, what was that like? You being the first ambassador for this new bureau.
Well, it was really a wonderful honor and privilege, to say the least. I had been so involved, particularly with First Lady Hillary Clinton. You know, it was 25 years ago that she was in Beijing, basically saying something that has echoed around the world ever since: women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. And we had worked so long and hard on a variety of issues that affect women and girls around the world. And then Vital Voices actually came out of that White House experience, because so many of the women with whom we've worked globally said, you know, where do we go now? And so it was an opportunity uh, for them to come together, to have the space in an organization where they could share best practices, know each other, cross borders, and really create that kind of network that women have always depended on. And while there, I got the call to see if I would be interested in really continuing this work in a much more significant level in the State Department. And really, my charge from the secretary was integrate these gender issues across everything we do at the State Department. And the State Department is far flung. It's embassies around the world,
Yeah.
it's economic policy, it's peace and stability, it's human rights, and it's war and peace. And really ensuring that women's perspectives and a women's lens, participation, was part of our decision making. And it was all about really creating better outcomes as a result, so we could be more successful in the mission we were carrying out for our country. So it was 24/7 uh, in Washington, and a lot of time outside of Washington. But it was an opportunity for America to stand up for our values, to understand that no country can get ahead if it's half of its people, its women, are put behind, and really to recognize that if we want vibrant democracies, if we want to act on climate change, if we want peace and stability, if we want to address our economic problems, we really need women's full participation. It can't happen without. And so that was the motivation, and that was a big part of the job.
So, I mean, essentially, you were integrating a feminist foreign policy perspective across the State Department, right?
Samantha, you're so smart. That's what we were essentially trying to do. We didn't call it a feminist foreign policy. That came later with our good friend Margaret Wallstrom when she was Secretary of State equivalent, the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. But essentially, that's what we were to do. She too laid out the need for full integration across their foreign policy, the resources that were necessary to do that, and respecting women's rights on all levels. So it's very much what we had really set to do.
How do you even go about that? I mean, the State Department is huge, like you said, and you have all these embassies around the world. I mean, how do you all of a sudden get them all to adopt a gendered lens?
Well, you work closely with your colleagues within departments. You look for those entry points. I'll give you an example. There is something called APEC. You hear about it maybe on the business page, certainly in terms of economic news. It's the 21 economies that hug the Pacific, and we're a big part of that platform. It's like a geographical United Nations in a way, faced on the economy. And one of my colleagues, who was the ambassador to APEC for the United States, came to me and he said, well, are you going to be participating in this conference? That year it was taking place in Japan. And I said to him, well, I've looked at the agenda. It says nothing about women's economic participation, yet we know we've got data increasing by the hour, that women are essential to creating economic growth, to inclusive prosperity, to creating jobs. They're a tremendous force within the economy. And I said, and there was also data on how much this Pacific region that we were a part of was losing in terms of its economic vitality because women were not critically involved. And so he said, well, I said to him, actually, is there anything we can do to change that? And he said, well, you could come over to Tokyo. There, all the ambassador equivalents are going to be meeting, and you can make the case. And so I managed to get there, and I don't think there was a woman in front of me in terms of that audience. And I made the case as best I could based on data, based on evidence, based on research. And the first person who came up to me afterwards said, oh my goodness, you talked about growing economies. Now, I don't know what he thought I would talk about, but maybe it was the Feminist Manifesto. But but as a result, the Japanese were embracing, as were the other participants. We had our first meetings during that time. And the following year, the United States was the leader. And at that meeting in the United States, that brings in top private sector corporate chiefs, as well as the presidents, heads of countries, of the economies, they passed a, uh, a strong platform for developing women's entrepreneurship, helping women in small and medium sized businesses that exist to this day, is very vibrant, and goes at those core obstacles. What's holding women back? Access to credit, access to markets, training, networks, access to technology. And that's what these 21 economies, these 21 countries have been working on. So that's an example of working across the department. In this case, it was a melding of the Economics Bureau and our Asia Pacific, but there is a role to begin to integrate these kinds of issues really across everything we do.
Absolutely. What do you think, looking back at your tenure, what do you feel like your biggest, if you had two or three big accomplishments, what would you categorize those
Well,
as?
I think the work that we did on women and the economy was in many ways quite seminal. We worked around the world on these issues. When I travel now, I still have women from places far flung, from Kyrgyzstan to Bosnia, saying to me, I remember when you brought us together. I remember when regionally we came together and we were able to begin to grow our economic situations as a result of learning about each other, having the resources, and having governments behind us. Um, I think really importantly also was our role in peace and security. Um, Secretary Clinton was very engaged on these issues. We're actually marking 20 years that the United Nations established something called Security Council Resolution 1325, which means they linked women to peace and security. Women and men experience security and conflict differently. We needed to recognize that and recognize that women belong in every aspect of peace building, from conflict resolution to post conflict recovery, and did tremendous amounts of work in that space. Of course, every conflict that we were trying to diffuse, uh, from what's happening in the DRC to what was happening in Afghanistan, et cetera, really had a role that we should and needed to be playing in terms of adopting a gender participatory role in it, and having our leaders, our diplomats recognizing that and being engaged. And today, the United States has the first ever law on women, peace, and security. So we are in that position. We need now to implement it fully, but it was an outgrowth of the work that we had done during our time at the State Department.
So tremendous. So now let's look at the period after you left. The position that you had was left open for about 3 years. What do you think the effect was of having that Ambassador of Global Women's Issues position empty for so long during the Trump administration?
Well, I don't think it was good. I mean, one of the things that was a reflection of what a difference we were able to make is that so many in the Foreign Service just said to me personally, and I can imagine that this represented a much wider reality, that they were carrying on this work as best they could. It was ingrained, beginning to get ingrained, which I think is important. The Trump administration tried to end this position,
Mm.
and it only continued because of the intervention of people in the Senate, senators who felt very strongly. And then it was, as you said, Samantha, it was left vacant for better than 3 years. Uh, Finally, there was Kelly Curry was nominated and confirmed for the position, but that was only several months ago. And It's a shame because America's vital role in working with other countries and more broadly didn't have a representative in that role. So um, that was unfortunate, and I am hoping that it can come back really strongly in the months to come.
Also, do you think so? I heard Kelly Curry speak at the foreign policy like forum, and the moderator asked like, don't you think all of the policies and reproductive rights that the Trump administration has, or the intolerant, the Helms Amendment, the global gag rule, is really anti-women? Like, do you think you can do like yes, you can do a lot for women, peace, and security, but there's a clear link between reproductive rights and empowerment. So I mean, do you feel like those are at odds?
Well, so much so. I mean, it wasn't the position that we held clearly. And you saw, I think you referenced early on what happened in the United Nations on this issue that almost brought down a resolution. It's a shame. She has to march to the orders that are put out for her from the administration. And, you know, I think that's certainly one area that it's very clear what she's supposed to do and not do.
Mm. So, one of the things that is happening too is that Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security and the Rockefeller Foundation published a report for the next Beijing conference, which is wild that it's coming up. Um, there were a few main levers for change cited, including resetting gender norms via the media and skills building training for girls, bridging gaps between law and practice, countering backlash to gender equality, fostering democratic inclusion and accountability, and harnessing technology. Is there one of those you'd like to focus on and think about it as a lever for change and how it could work?
Well, let me tell you what we tried to do and tell your wonderful audience. Uh, it was 25 years since the Beijing conference took place. The purpose of that meeting was the United Nations bringing people together, majority women, tens of thousands, both in the official meeting that was mostly government representatives, and then the unofficial meeting of civil society, women, some men from all over the world. And the goal of that UN Fourth World Conference was really to state and ensure the path for equality between men and women, full gender equality. And there was a platform for action adopted in Beijing. It was adopted by consensus by over 180 countries, and it included access to education, access to health care, women's full participation in the economies of their countries, in the politics of their countries, uh, legal protections, being free from violence. We look back and think, well, what was the big deal? In those days, violence against women, domestic violence was not really a mandate to the states where they had the obligation to protect their citizens. It was as criminal as we know it was often seen as private or cultural. It is criminal, and the perpetrators need to be punished, and women need to be protected. that all came out of Beijing in terms of laws that were passed in countless countries, many of them not fully enforced or implemented, but laws are on the books, setting out this obligation to provide this protection under the law. And that was just one of many changes. Girls' education um, was not as significant a global priority as it has come to be, recognizing that one of the best things you can do, certainly in a country that's developing, is educate a girl. You educate a girl, you educate a family, a community. She practices better practices in terms of her family spacing when she's married, when she has a job, she gets a better job, better nutrition for her children, just tremendous benefits that come out of that education. So 25 years later, we were looking at where are the gaps continuing? What haven't we done well? And you mentioned in particular levers. Uh, there are obstacles that are still in place that are inhibiting the kind of progress we need to see. So let's take an obstacle. Uh, Norms. Uh, this is attitudes, mindsets, biases. It's all in that category of somehow women are not fully entitled. They are not equal to fundamentally state the case where these norms get in the way. So one of the things you begin to do is unpack this. How do you deal with these norms? Because they're deeply entrenched practices in many places. They're attitudes we deal with here in terms of workplace harassment or women not being promoted in the way that they should, given their full qualifications and more. Um, and it requires actions on all levels. It requires a government continuing to ensure protections so that these norms uh, don't become so discriminatory that they are problematic. It requires civil society, all of us acting in our own space. It requires the private sector. And I'll give you an anecdote because sometimes people say, well, it's really hard to change these norms. And I remember being in Senegal with then First Lady Hillary Clinton. And we were out in a village with a group of villagers watching a program evolve. It was to teach the rudiments of democracy to the villagers. And I was told afterwards, we couldn't understand what was happening. We saw them raise hands, we saw them argue. Clearly, it was a democratic process that they were inculcating in the villagers. And the woman who was in charge of the program told us later that the women villagers came to her and they said, so what do you do with this thing called democracy that you're teaching us? And the trainer said to them, well, do you see any problems in your life? Is there something you want to fix? And they started to tell her about a practice called female genital cutting or FGM.
Mm.
And it was deeply entrenched. It was a rite of passage. If you were a young woman, you had to go through this. It created tremendously debilitating health consequences, often death in childbirth. It was degrading. It was a human rights violation.
Absolutely.
And laws had been passed to deal with it, even in that country, but the law didn't change the practice on the ground. This was deeply embedded. And so what happened? The women went to the first they went to the imam, the religious leader in the village, and he said, well, there's nothing in the Quran that mandates this practice. They went on to the village chiefs, all male, and began to explain how this was harming them. And mind you, if you were a woman who wanted to have her place, she couldn't hold that place in her community if she didn't go through this practice. Long story short, there was tremendous work that went on. It was communicating at the village level, to men and women, women talking about it, families talking about it. And in the end, that village voted to outlaw the practice. The norm changed from FGM to the health of our women. That
Incredible.
became the thing that they wanted to do, protect women's health because it mattered to them. And then it was the village chiefs, the men, who said, well, we intermarry with many other villages and they practice this. We should begin to go there. And
Wow.
they did.
Wow.
And there's a very vibrant NGO called Tostan. There are
Yep.
some others.
Molly.
And
Molly.
Molly Melching. And what they have done is really work to completely eradicate this practice through the work of the villagers, through the work of the people on the ground, to really change this practice. And the allies became traditional leaders, chiefs, religious leaders, male allies to promote the well being of women. So that's how norms can really interfere with the well-being of women and certainly their equal rights.
Yeah, I think it's important. I interviewed Molly a while ago on a panel at school, and I think what it is important to point out though that norms don't change overnight. Like
They
Molly's
do not.
approach with Toast On is like they do like intensive work with like one village for I think it's like at least a year.
Well,
Um,
this took months and months and
yeah,
months. And you're exactly right. And Molly's certainly exactly right. It takes time, but what it shows is it can be done. Now, it's important to have the law, but the law isn't going to bring this change
right.
in terms of mindsets, in terms of these practices.
Right, right. Yeah, it's just and then thinking because it was just interesting with Molly, like the funding perspective. When you look at funders, is funders a lot of the time want to fund a program that touches a million people. A million girls go to school, but cultural change and norm change takes a lot longer, and the work is a lot deeper with a smaller amount of people. So I think it's just something interesting to think about when it comes to philanthropy and government funding and all those kinds of things that you can't just give money and expect it to be an overnight solution.
Well, I think that's right, Samantha. And I think the other thing we're realizing today, how critically important is to have male allies. Even
Right.
when the Women's Equal Rights Convention took place in the United States, all of those years and years ago, um, one of the top leaders with the women, a third of them were men. Frederick Douglass, for example, was one of them. And I'll tell you just very, very quickly that I had a really interesting experience in India some years ago when I was still ambassador, and I had announced a program for men. They were illiterate. These were largely villagers who were illiterate, but domestic violence was extremely high and needed to be dealt with, and we were looking for creative ways to address it. So part of it was to involve the males, and they did it through skits, and they performed a
Mm,
skit in front of me, not letting the hand go to harm the woman, for example.
mm,
And they had said several months after that, many months after that, that they hoped to see me again. And I got this message, and when I was back there, I thought, well, I have no idea what they want to tell me. um, and the first thing I said to them is, well, are you succeeding? Is violence against women in your village going down? Oh, yes, yes, they wanted to say. But they said, that's not why we want to talk to you. We want to tell you that we have changed. Through this experience, we understand that being a male is not the same as expecting behavior that is abusive of women. Their attitudes began to change and they saw themselves benefiting. And I think this is such an important part, that men involved in these issues are co-beneficiaries of the progress that women make. And so that whole arena of it's what in Sweden we see with parental leave that men take full advantage of because it's provided for them. And what are they saying? Nobody ever told me how meaningful it was to bond with your baby. Um, it's a new experience. And so these attitudes take time, but they can change, and incentives and group work, like we saw in so many places, really begins to have impact.
Yeah, Gary Barker was on my show last week or 2 weeks ago, who runs Promundo and works with men on changing norms around masculinity around the world, and he's done
Yeah,
incredible
he's
work.
done fabulous work, and they're one of the leaders. And it's actually Promundo that has developed this understanding of men as
Yeah,
co-beneficiaries.
yeah, it's tremendous. So I don't have you for that long, so I do want to move on. So one thing that Georgetown has hot off the press is you basically took your an index that you'd done globally that basically ranked countries against each other with regards to three factors: justice, inclusion, and security. And you decided to take it to the state level. And since this is the dawn of the US election, usually I like to focus truthfully more on international issues, but because this is hot off the press and we're coming up on the US election, I want to talk a little bit about that report that just came out. So, first, I just want to say, before we get into the best states and the worst states, the US on the global index ranked 19th on that index. So, we're not doing so great when it comes to women's rights. And then the other thing is that the US actually ranked 35th specifically on the security factor. And that had to do with violence against women. So in the report, you say 37% of women in America have experienced violence at the hands of an intimate partner at some point in their life. That means over 1 out of 3 women have experienced violence at the hands of an intimate partner. I mean, that's staggering. And then the other point you make is that American society faces a unique crisis of lethal intimate partner violence because of widespread availability of firearms. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and so let me, Samantha, you did a fabulous job in describing it. Let me give a little sense to your audience of why we did this. So this is the first ever global report on women, peace, and security, an area that we've been discussing. And what is different about this report, and it's all based on data that's widely recognized. We didn't create any new data for this. But instead of looking at one dimension, inclusion, dimension means economic, education, health, etc. And usually that's where most of the data lies and where most of the indices are created. We also looked at two other dimensions: justice, discriminatory practices, a lot about which we have also just been talking, and security. And security is, are you safe in your home? Are you safe in your community? And out of that, we were ranked 19th globally. And the reason is that countries where domestic violence, for example, is pervasive, you see a direct correlation where women's rights are denied, for example, and oppressed. Those countries tend to be much more unstable and mired in conflict. And the United States, on this global index, we found, as you said, that the access to firearms makes the situation of domestic violence that much worse. It's exacerbated um, because obviously the ability to do somebody in a much more lethal way is much more accessible. So what we did just in the last week or so was take a look over at the United States itself. And we thought this was an opportune time. Many say you look at all these other countries, why don't you look at the United States itself? So we took the same methodology and we looked at the 50 states. Obviously not the same measurements, but the three dimensions were intact. And what we found is, depending where you live, says a lot about the protections you get, the support you get, etc. And we rated the best states and the worst states. Every state is actually ranked, but it goes through a range of issues. And on the security dimension, certainly domestic violence is a critical issue. We found that in a number of states, large numbers of states, women don't feel safe walking in their neighborhood within a mile of their home. The prevalence of firearms in the majority of states, um, there is no prohibition to having a firearm if you are a domestic abuser. So this
That can
all,
we just stop there for 1 second, Professor Revere? That just is so wild. Like I understand all of the, people want to have their guns, blah blah blah, but that we can't even pass something federally to limit domestic abusers that have protective orders on them from having weapons. It's like what? It's like setting yourself up for, hey, like let these people kill their wives. I mean, I don't get it. Like how is that possible?
well, it's unfortunate, and that's one of the reasons I think it's important to raise awareness. It's important to provide tools like this so that we as citizens can make judgments about what we want our representatives to be doing. And, there's something about understanding how uneven the situation is in many states. Most of the Northeast states do very, very well. Many of the southern states do very, very poorly. So at the top you have Massachusetts, at the bottom you have Louisiana,
And I
and
have a
then
map up that shows, you can't see it, but I have a map up that shows that the dark green is the states where it's best to be a woman, and then the dark red is the places where it's worse. So I just have a map up for the audience so they can see it while you're talking about it.
well, and if your audience wants to access this, you can go to our website, which is giwps.georgetown.edu. And both for the global index and the US index, you literally, for the global one, you can go in and press a country and see where it stands and what the criteria is on that basis. And for the United States, you can do likewise on the states.
Mm.
So it's readily accessible.
Yep, and I'll put a
But
link to it in the chat so that people can see the link.
that would be great. And I think it's just when you think of how important these issues are, and you mentioned the election, and I think one of the things to me that this index brought to mind very clearly is the need for federal action,
Yeah.
so that if you live in a state that isn't particularly supportive and protective, if there were federal action, it would be different because everybody would access the same. And if you look at, for example, uh, family leave, paid family leave, we are the only industrialized country in the world that does not have paid parental leave. We don't have access to childcare in terms of it being more accessible and affordable. We've done very little comparatively to the need on a federal level. The whole issue of equal pay and minimum wage, so much that should happen um, at the federal level, we really need to see action on.
Now, do we need to have the Senate for that to like when I say we, do Democrats need to control the Senate for that to happen, or are some of these bipartisan issues that could be passed if there was enough attention paid to them?
Well, I think you just raised another really interesting point, and that is, we only have 26% of our Senate is female and 25% of our House. And that is a tremendous jump thanks to the 2018 off-year election when so many more women were elected. One of the phenomena we see, and it always doesn't work perfectly, but women tend to move from their partisan political views or the strong views on some issues that their party may hold that as women they see they want action on.
Mm.
That happened originally on violence against women. It happened on Title IX. It happened on women's health care issues. It was this coming together first of the women across the aisle and then large numbers of their male colleagues. So it is conceivable that even without a majority say in the Senate, we could get some of this done. But it's obviously much harder.
Hmm. Another thing that you pointed out, so since we're talking about women in Congress, is women in the state legislature, and that's both an indicator, and it's also, but there was something really stunning um, that said that like every, I can't find the stat now, but like for every year that the state is, oh, here it is, every additional year that the Democratic Party controlled the state since 2000 is associated with a 0.006 point higher average US WPS index. So that, I mean, you know, being
Well,
controlled by the Democrats is makes the state better for women.
and on many of these issues, if not all of them, the party is much more progressive and embracing, and holds them as a priority. We have had a many a year, over too many years, I should say, that we've not made progress on some of these issues. And I am hoping that if we've learned the lesson of COVID, where dramatic inequalities have been spotlighted, exposed for what they are, um, particularly because of the disproportionate impacts on women that COVID has had, that we begin to address these inequalities, and that maybe coming out of this terrible crisis, there will be the opportunity, along with election results, to really address issues like childcare. They're calling, many economists are calling what's happening to women economically during COVID as a she session,
Yeah.
not a recession or a depression, but a she session, because women, the great majority of people losing their jobs are women. And increasingly, we're now seeing women also leaving the job workplace because of their responsibilities at home. They can't work remotely and do the childcare requirements and the household requirements. So, addressing childcare, addressing paid leave, hopefully, this crisis will provide an opportunity, if seized, and a lesson, if learned, to really address these issues.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. One stat that really shook me was that 1 in 5 mothers in the U.S. report their children not eating adequately because they can't afford enough food right now. Like that, I just like makes me want to cry. Like, like
Well,
that's horrible.
and just watching the images every night, night after night for these many months, and seeing how desperate the situation is, for so many, and think of, um, single parents and those who are in families that already didn't have what they adequately needed. It's just a really desperate situation that we have to rectify. And I think one of the first things that needs to be done, which still hasn't happened, even though the need is so great and we're seeing all the repercussions, is we need an emergency relief package that also takes these issues into serious consideration and addresses them.
Yeah, I think there was also a statistic that 4 out of 5 Black mothers are breadwinners for the family, and then with women living more likely in poverty than men, plus African American and Native women and Latina living in even more poverty, that doesn't spell something great for African American families. And it's again staggering.
Well, and it's poverty for sure, but if you, one of the clear uh, pictures that comes out of the US index is how much racial injustice and racial inequality is compounded for women, for African American women, certainly Latinas and other women of color. Their situation is so much worse in many ways in terms of the statistics than it is for white women.
Yeah. One other thing that pointed out, I mean, the report talks about the challenges that women face in running for office, and also the amount of women in state legislature, and it's from as high as, I think it's 52% in Nevada to something like I don't know, like 12% or 14% in Mississippi. And there's a lot of research that basically when women are in the legislature, they put forth things that are gender responsive. Um,
Well,
yeah.
and you see that all over the world. Nevada is very interesting because it's a majority women legislature now. But that has long been the case, and it's understandable. Uh, Women suffer the negative consequences of not being a part of the legislative process or only being a tiny minority, say, because the decisions that are being made impact them and their families, but they have no role for the most part in those decisions. So when they come in, you can see bringing those perspectives and those experiences, those understandings. Why act on childcare? Why the necessity to do something about violence against women, etc. Those issues then come into the public fora uh, to move decisions so that these issues can be addressed. So women really, they make a difference across the board, obviously, but on these kinds of issues, it is a pronounced difference.
So one thing, when I was watching your panel interview about the report with a bunch of amazing academics and practitioners, one thing one woman said is America doesn't have the stomach for quotas. Why have all of these Western European countries, I mean, even Italy, which is not super progressive with women's rights, has integrated a quota. Why why can't we have quotas? Like what does she mean we don't have the stomach for it?
Well, I think there is a strong sense that quotas would never pass muster here politically. And you'd have to do a anthropological analysis of some kind to understand why that would not be something that was workable. You know, there are quotas both for political parties to incentivize them. Sometimes they are moved differently, and sometimes they will rather have penalties than make a difference in bringing more women into the party. There are quotas for boards, women on boards in some companies. And then much more so, there have been affirmative kinds of initiatives and actions to make that change without something that was mandated. But there are many places in the world, and I always find it interesting that the United States, when it came to Afghanistan or to Iraq, for example, were very supportive of quotas because,
Oh, how interesting.
we're eager to ensure that women get to play a role in the decision making of those countries for the future of those countries. But it's highly unlikely that we would ever endorse that in our own
I don't
situation.
get that. Didn't anyone call us out and be like, "You're hypocrites. We don't want a gender quota. You guys don't do
It,
a gender
it,
quota."
it doesn't change the reality, Samantha, I'm afraid.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, Ambassador Verveer. Um, I do have one last question for you. Would you consider a position in a Biden administration?
Well, I think what makes the most sense for me is I've been privileged to be in government for many, many years, both in the White House, in the State Department, working on the Hill. And I want to see more young people come in, people who are ready, have lots of talent and experiences to really move us forward on the issues we've been discussing tonight, but on so many other issues for our country. We have so much talent out there, and I think we need to tap that talent in spades.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer. It was such a delight. I also, we didn't plan the matching, but I do love that we match. Um, um, it's such a privilege and a pleasure to have you on my show.
Well, thank you, Samantha. Thank you for your enthusiasm and commitment to this work. I know deep down, having spoken to you several times in the past, how much meaning there is in it for you. And I think what you do is a public service in actually having Samanthropolitics be something that so many can tap and learn from. So it was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Reveal. I will talk to you very, very soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Oh, I love her. Um, so so many things that she's obviously she's been at events or moderating panels all day long, so I wanted to give her a break. But there's a couple things that I want to mention based on what we just spoke about. So one of the things that actually she said when I want other people to serve, when I've been talking to voters, is some people say, oh, well, I don't think Joe Biden's that great, or like Sleepy Joe or something like that. And what I try to explain to them is that the president is one person. There is a huge government behind a president. The president is honestly more so a figurehead. Usually they don't make policy by toilet tweeting. Policy is crafted by tons of really, really smart people, and then it goes to the president, and the president says, okay, I think this is a good policy, I think this is a bad policy, I think this is an okay policy, based on lots and lots of expert recommendations. And it's not just somebody like, deciding on a policy change because he had a nice lunch with Xi Jinping or with Putin. Like, that's not how policy is usually made. So you have to understand in this election, if a Biden administration comes in, what Ambassador Verveer didn't mention is the flood of people who have left the Foreign Service and the civil service under the Trump administration. People at the State Department have been sidelined. People with serious expertise have been kind of, demoted because they worked on the Iran deal, and so therefore they're a Muslim terrorist. I mean, this stuff is crazy town, and so many people have left because they don't want to peddle this administration's policies, and because the morale of the State Department has been horrible from day one when Tillerson took over, brought in his McKinsey consultants to treat the place like a business of where can you create more efficiency, not understanding that this is a place that does diplomacy. It doesn't do cost-benefit analysis for companies. It prevents war and creates peace and creates relationships between countries. You can't come in and do some kind of cost analysis like you would in a private sector company. Plus the federal hiring freeze, so then people didn't have the support that they needed. All of these positions, including this position we just talked about, stayed vacant for the longest time. Some positions are still vacant. Okay? Like, there's not enough people in government, and so much of the talent is left. So when I talk to voters and they say, oh, Sleepy Joe, whatever, there are so many talented people, many of whom I went to school with at the Fletcher School, diplomats I've worked with who are waiting in the wings to come into a Biden administration. And frankly, Trump just hasn't been able to tap that talent because nobody wants to work for him, or very few people want to work for him. Hence why there was something like a 22-year-old who was an intern on his campaign was running like narcotics and law enforcement or something. I mean, he literally had like interns from his campaign running major departments of the United States government. That just should not happen. So it's not just Biden coming in. It is the mass of incredible public servants who are going to come in because they know that Biden cares about public service. He cares about public service. He's not there as an opportunist who's there to make more money for his hotels by having the RNC right next to his the Trump hotel. I mean, he really genuinely cares about public service, and he cares about bringing in really, really smart people. And I've seen them in the working groups. There's some unbelievably bright, talented, dedicated public servants that are really waiting to serve, and frankly to undo a lot of the damage that the Trump administration has done over the last 4 years. So I just wanted to make that point. It's not just about electing a president. It's about electing this mass of incredibly smart and talented people that really have been driven out in droves during the Trump regime, as I'll call it. A couple other things that I wanted to point out that came out in this report that was really, really interesting. So I want to go back to the beginning about who were the best. So if we go back to looking at the states that were the best places to be a woman. So we saw that on the graph. And let's bring that map back up again. Whoops.
You've tamed the
so we saw again, all of the best places to be a woman are in the Northeast, which is really, really interesting. And they're all blue states. If you look at the worst places to be a woman, they're mostly, well, they're actually red in this graph, but they also are heavily held Republican states. So that's not a coincidence. And so when you actually talk to respondents in these surveys and in their states, when you talk to Massachusetts residents, so Massachusetts was number one, then Connecticut, and then DC. I'm privileged to have actually lived most of my life in all of those three places. This is what they said. This is the reason that it's one of the best places to be a woman. Okay, so you can see the things that are in kind of the biggest are the things that people said the most. So the number one thing was Democrats. I mean, the Democratic Party cares more about gender equality. Full stop. It's something like 70% of Democratic men think that people in public office should work on women's issues. And let's see if I can find the stat. I think it's 16% of men think that we should let that legislators should work on women's issues. I mean, that is a staggering difference. You also see on here education. Education is incredibly important, and having that education. Progressive politics, huge. Liberal. I mean, the biggest things on here are basically saying, hey, we are a good place to be a woman because the Democratic Party is our government, and that it's a more progressive party. I mean, it is. Like, the fact that so many women live in houses with guns, and the Republican Party is the party that's all about guns. And guess what? If you have a gun in your house, the likelihood of domestic violence ending up in a homicide is fivefold. Okay, it's fivefold. It doesn't matter if the person's a responsible gun owner. Okay, that incidence, I mean, women's security is threatened when there's so many guns around, and frankly, men's are too, because the homicide rates for men in the U.S. are out of freaking control, and most of them are committed with firearms. It's firearms. I can't understand why this country can't do something about guns, and it's so embarrassing when you go to Europe. I was in a cab in Spain, and the cab driver was from Afghanistan, and he said, I love Spain, me encanta España, like, I would go to America, I love America, but I'm scared because there's so many guns there. I came from war, I don't want to go back to war. Like, they literally, this is pre all the riots, everything that just happened, they literally perceive it as a place that's in war because there's so many guns and because there's a mass shooting every 10 freaking seconds in the US. I mean, we don't even hear about a lot of the mass shootings anymore. Like, 3 people? That's not on the news. 10 people? Not on the news. It only gets to the news when it's like 20. Guns, just unbelievable. So then if you look at the worst states to be a woman in the United States, they were Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. And what did people say about why those are the worst states to be a woman? Let's look at that word cloud. Okay, so you can clearly see. So poverty, huge, really, really important. That being said, the Republican Party is always against increasing the minimum wage. And I thought another really interesting thing in the report was saying that much of the conversation around addressing poverty is centered around getting people jobs. But that obscures the fact that many workers live in poverty while working. It's not just that people are unemployed, it's that the minimum wage is so low that they cannot support themselves. And they cannot support their families on that minimum wage. And yet Republicans are always the one to say, we don't want to raise the minimum wage. Like, God, no one to give to those people. Tradition, right? So that's one of the things that Ambassador Verveer was just talking about. Harmful cultural norms. Those types of, quote unquote traditions that keep women down. I'll never forget when I was talking to somebody about why white women voted for, that's staggering stat, like 52% of white women voted for Trump. And I was talking to a woman from the South, and she said, well, in the South, we're taught that women don't belong in politics. And that floored me. And something in this survey as well was that something like 50% of Republican men believe that women should be I want to get the stat right. Or maybe it's in those states, believe that women should be stay home and the man should be the breadwinner. I mean, we have some serious craziness. Also, 57% of wait, what is this? Something like 57% of Republican women and 67% of Republican men think that gender equality, wait for this, in the US has already been achieved. Like, I literally don't understand that. Like, if you're a woman and you walk in and you say, you realize that your person that is the same level as you in the same position is making $50,000 more than you, has gender equality been achieved? Like, I don't get that. I mean, we also have these staggering statistics where, white men, for every $1 that white men earn, black women earn 62 cents, Native American women earn 57 cents, and Latino women earn 54 cents. Latino women are earning half as much as white men. Like, on every white man's dollar, a Latino woman, same position, is there. Like, that is crazy. And you wonder why Latina and Native and black women are more likely to live in poverty. Oh, stuff gets me so upset. So you also see racism. You see the Bible Belt, the impact of religion. A lot of people will vote for for the Republican Party simply because it is anti-choice. And yet, this always just makes me crazy that, they're anti-choice and they want women to not have abortions. And she didn't mention that, like, something like 19 out of 20 women in DC have access to a healthcare or an abortion provider within their county. It's like 1 out of 20, or I don't even remember, like 96% of women in Wyoming don't have access to an abortion provider in their county. That's freaking crazy town. So it's like, okay, well, you don't want women to get abortions, okay, or to have birth control, frankly, because there was this whole thing where, Hobby Lobby and religious groups don't have to provide birth control or pay for abortions. And yet, what happens when these kids are born? Many of them end up in poverty. And then that party is saying, well, don't raise the minimum wage. So it's like, okay, well, you have to have a baby, but then we're not going to help you take care of it at all. Too bad. Sucks for you. It's just the idiosyncrasy is just boggles my freaking mind. Another crazy stat that floored me. Master's degree women often earn the same as men with a bachelor's degree. So women who have master's degrees like myself earn as much as men who have a bachelor's. Now, master's degrees are expensive, and women actually hold the majority of student loan debt in the United States. So why do we have to do more? Why do we have to have more schooling to hold the same job as a man who has a bachelor's degree? And I've experienced this myself in being in the same position as a man with a bachelor's degree, or he wasn't even, and he was earning $10,000 more than me, and I didn't even know until later, and I had a master's degree and $80,000 in master's degree student loan debt. I also think this raises an interesting point of, should we potentially have less interest for women student loan borrowers, unless we can fix this disparity? Should we? I don't know. So it's just, you cannot divorce the fact that the worst places to be a woman are Republican controlled states. You just can't. I mean, you literally see it on the map. And that explains why so many Democratic women are running for office, but the Republican Party is struggling to get women to run for office for them. Because they're in a party that's anti-woman. It is literally anti-woman. There's no way around it. It is anti-women. Like, letting a domestic abuser who has a protective order have a firearm? That is anti-woman. I mean, you're putting women's lives at risk. I literally can't. All right, a few more things that I thought were really interesting in this report. Oh, this was staggering. 45% of female-headed households in Louisiana live in poverty. 45% of female-headed households in Louisiana live in poverty. And this was the stat. In Mississippi, 91% of women live in a county without an abortion provider. It's just staggering. going. So I also just want to talk about a couple of the things that I mean, it's pretty obvious at this point that I'm a Democrat. People who know me know that I'm a Democrat, and I'm a frequent Facebook poster. But I do want to outline some of the ways that women's rights have been rolled back under Trump, and some of the plans that Biden actually has to roll forward women's rights. If you're a woman watching this and thinking about, okay, who should I vote for? So, the Obama and Biden administration, one thing that Ambassador Verveer didn't mention, but she was very involved in, was the White House Council on Women and Girls, which was created by the Obama and Biden administration specifically to tackle some of the issues we talked about that are crippling women and frankly crippling our economy, like equal pay, paid family leave, which is what we're just talking about, and poverty, effectively. The Trump administration, for no reason whatsoever, disbanded it and put nothing in its place. Great. So the Biden administration would create a White House Council on Gender Equality, which would be chaired by a senior member of the Executive Office of the President, who would be tasked solely with guiding and coordinating government policy that impacts women and girls, such as economic policy, healthcare, racial justice, gender-based violence, and foreign policy. So by putting somebody in the Executive Office of the President, okay, that's dealing with gender equality, that's showing how important it is to a Biden administration to make the United States a more gender equal place. We also have yet to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, because there's lots of states that haven't ratified it. If anyone hasn't seen the show Mrs. America, it's fantastic. It's about Phyllis Schlafly, who is a anti-feminist, even though a lot of the things that she was doing, she was just lucky she had a husband that kind of let her do those things, because if she didn't, then I think she would have been a real feminist. But she joined forces with the anti-abortion movement to block the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in a bunch of key states. So Biden will make it a priority to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. He also supports repealing the Hyde Amendment. Now, the Hyde Amendment basically says that Medicaid, people that have Medicaid can't pay for, that Medicaid will not pay for abortions because or that might be the Helms Amendment. I'll talk about both of them. That's a Hyde Amendment. That Medicaid cannot pay for abortions. So I read this like really sad report about women on Medicaid who need abortions, and how they're cobbling together, pawning their jewelry and asking people for money to try to be able to get an abortion, because Medicaid doesn't pay for abortion, because the Hyde Amendment says federal funding cannot pay for abortions, because we're this apparently super religious state that is just crazy. So he'll repeal the Hyde Amendment because women need access to healthcare. And if you're looking from an economic argument, and you don't want to support welfare, why would you want the poorest women to not be able to access reproductive health care? Because they're not going to be able to support their children, and those are going to be the people on welfare. The economic argument just doesn't make sense with the anti-choice argument. It is totally at odds. He also will make sure that we'll continue to have free birth control, which Trump has rolled back some of that. And I was just talking about student debt. He'll alleviate student debt burdens on women. This was really interesting. I didn't know this until I was literally reading his website. He will forgive all undergraduate tuition-related federal student debt from 2- and 4-year public colleges and universities for debt holders earning less than $125,000. So I want to make that really clear. So if you're somebody who is went to a public college or university, and you are earning less than $125,000 a year, your tuition or your loans will be forgiven. That is amazing. That is so incredibly amazing. Graduate school too. Biden, graduate school would be great. This will also apply to individuals holding federal student loans for tuition from private HBCUs and MSIs. This is also there's a really cool program called the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which a lot of DC people I know that are watching this show probably subscribe to this Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. And basically it says if you serve 10 years in the government, all of your student loan debt is forgiven. That's federal. Everything that's taken out through the government is forgiven. But it takes a long time to get there. And it's also, you can also do 10 years of community service, or combine community service, and community service meaning working for a verified 501c3 nonprofit, and also working for the government. All your student loan debt will be forgiven. Well, not only does Biden obviously want to continue that program, but he wants to make it more generous by offering $10,000 of undergraduate or graduate student debt relief for every single year of national or community service up to 5 years. So meaning if you work for a nonprofit for 3 years, you could have $30,000 of your student loan debt that you owe the U.S. government forgiven. That means I would have probably $20,000 or $30,000 less of student loan debt. That would be amazing. And I think people should be given some incentive and some thank you for doing public service. Because you know what? You don't get paid very much at nonprofits. And it's hard work, and it's stressful, and you're saving the world, and the nonprofit doesn't even have enough money to give you a pencil. And you can barely live. And then to pay student loan debt, it's you literally can't do it. Do 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 do. What else? Obviously, there would be a lot of revisions when it comes to gun control. We need to get guns under control in this country. Another insidious thing that Trump did, which was just so freaking random and unnecessary. This just kills me. In response to Black Lives Matter, he got rid of diversity training for government contractors and said he would withdraw federal funding from schools that implement diversity training. I mean, that's just stupid. This is training and I do this type of corporate training, and it's to help people understand race better, to relate to one another better, to understand the different sorts of biases that women face, from pregnancy bias to confirmation bias, to help people understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, and therefore to have more empathy for other people that are different from them, and have empathy for their coworkers. I mean, really, diversity training is really about creating a more productive company or organization or school that has less incidences of violence, less incidences of sexual assault, and ultimately is more lucrative. It ends up producing more money. So that this decree that government contractors that get government money can't have diversity training is stupid. So dumb. So, Biden will reissue and mandate strict compliance to promote diversity and inclusion in the federal workforce. I think I want to point out too, I think it's 3 out of 23 cabinet members of Trump are women. Don't quote me on that, but it's something crazy low, and it's one person of color. His cabinet is the most undiverse cabinet we've seen since I don't even know who. He will also make sure that we create a diversity and inclusion plan for the federal workforce. He's also going to reverse. Betsy DeVos passed this ridiculous thing that basically made students who are accused of sexual assault, gave them more favor on college campuses than the women typically that are actually assaulted. So he'll also, roll back that sort of thing. And he's also going to make it a priority to figure out parental leave. What do we do about parental leave? I mean, it's such a good point that Ambassador Verveer makes. So many women are leaving the workforce because they don't have childcare, and they cannot take care of their children and get them online for Zoom school and do their job at the same time. And you see people that come to work with their kids because they can't afford childcare, so they just bring their kid. And I mean, that's so incredibly sad. We are facing a crisis. And so something that I know Ambassador Verveer agrees with me on is that this is a freaking crisis. And we finally have that light where now dads are understanding too what it's like to have their kids at home while they're trying to do work because they can't go to the office because their office is closed during COVID. It's really hard. So, COVID is also giving us a chance, I think, to resolve some of these policies. But I'm genuinely worried that 4 more years of a Trump administration, literally, a former ambassador literally said on a panel that she thinks the State Department will cease to exist under Trump administration because he does not understand what the State Department does. He does not understand. Whereas Mattis basically said, you get rid of funding for the State Department, you're going to have more war. Our guys are going to be in battle more if you get rid of funding for the State Department. I mean, that's only one repercussion, but there's so many more things at stake with regards to women's rights in the U.S. election. Roe v. Wade could seriously be overturned. Like, this is not a joke. This is not a joke. And this is one other thing, too, I want to make clear, is that some people don't realize just because you wouldn't have an abortion doesn't mean that you're pro-life. It doesn't. If you wouldn't have an abortion personally, but you think that any woman should have the right to choose whether she should, you are pro-choice. Hands down, you are pro-choice. Okay? But because the right has made pro-life sound like if you're not pro-life, then you're anti-life, that means that it's very confusing for people that personally disagree with abortion for themselves, but still think that women have a right to choose. It's extremely confusing. So I just want to clear that up too, that some women actually think that they're pro-life, but they're really pro-choice. All right, so I'm going to close up this very passionate show with this incredible woman who was, like, hearing her talk about, like, she was there before women, peace, and security were linked. She was there when there were no laws against violence and domestic violence in certain countries, and saying that, like, it's not okay to abuse your spouses. I mean, the way that Ambassador Verveer was able to push through so many things and change so many norms. I mean, if I could do a tenth of what she did in her life, like, my legacy is there. So, last public service announcement, vote, vote, vote. If you're interested in volunteering, there are still phone banks every day. It is so important that you call people in swing states and talk to them. Most of them that you talk to, if you are a Democrat, they're not going to be Trump supporters. You're not going to be with hostile, angry people. It's mostly Democrats that you're basically just helping them make a plan to vote and helping them know where their polling stations are. You can feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in volunteering. I'll be going to Pennsylvania myself for the next 5 days and wearing PPE and knocking on people's doors and encouraging them to get out the vote. I genuinely worry that if Trump were reelected, we would turn into a dictatorship. I'm not kidding. Like, I genuinely think he could pull a Putin and find some way to change the laws so that he is elected again for the next 20 years, or only somebody, you know, with the Trump last name is reelected. I think we would start to see freedom of speech really be taken away. I think our environmental rights are going to be stripped. We might start seeing pollution in our streams. He's whipped back a bunch of environmental things so that private sector companies can pollute. Like, we're gonna see more forest fires. People are still continue to die from COVID. There's just so much at stake in this election that you can't sit this one out. You just can't. Even if you don't like Joe, like, do you like humanity? Cool. If you like humanity, you need to vote for the Democratic Party. So on that note, I will see you next week with Susanna Welford, who is the head of an organization that trains young women to run for office. And I know Susanna has probably put the seedling in for a lot of young women that are going to run for office in the future. She's going to be my guest next Friday, where we may or may not see the results of the election. So until then, thank you so much for watching. Please share with your friends. Please subscribe to the Facebook channel, Samanthropolitics, if you haven't already. And I'll see you next week. Everybody cross your fingers, cross your toes, and get on a phone bank. Okay, bye-bye.